Hello, and thank you very much for coming along once again. This evening we're caught between two different holidays. On the one hand, Halloween, and on the other hand, coming up this week, Thanksgiving, and shortly after that, Christmas, and before you know it, it'll be Valentine's Day. And one thing all of these holidays have in common is that we usually spend a lot of time and considerable amounts of money actually celebrating them by consuming. And consuming not just things in general, but particular kinds of things, festive holiday things that we associate with good times and the like. And that means usually overconsumption of things we like to eat. And among those, primary among them is in fact chocolate. Chocolate seems to be the way that Americans are celebrating their holidays and everything else, like Valentine's Day, the relationships and things. So today we want to look at the dark chocolate, that is, dark side of chocolate, and look at the bitter truth behind the sweets we all enjoy. We've come to consider them part of celebrating. And in fact, some people actually argue that they've become addicted to chocolate, that it has an addicting character to it. But in any case, it's very clear that it was present here on Halloween in October, and it's about to be celebrated again on Turkey Day. Some people call it Thanksgiving Day. Some people call it the day before Black Friday. In any case, it's coming up and likely to be celebrated by a lot of chocolate. Christmas seems to have its share of chocolate as well, and of course Valentine's Day has made chocolate into a kind of consumer bash of one kind or another. And the attachment to chocolate begins very young. In fact, a lot of the marketing is aimed at getting children used to consuming chocolate, even when their parents admonish them not to. But the impact is not just on kids. Parents love chocolate too, and they love to give it back and forth to each other for special occasions. But this lifelong consumption of one of our favorite foods has a dark side that needs to be understood, and that needs to be understood very thoroughly. Yes, cocoa does grow on trees, but chocolate does not. And there's a difference between cocoa and chocolate, and by the time it becomes chocolate, it's something quite a bit different in the international food system than where it started out. The story of how chocolate comes to us is often not pretty. Yet we ought to take a look at it, especially at this time of year. The question has been raised again and again, are we in the presence of a new form of slavery in producing chocolate? It seems that child slavery is involved, at least according to the reports coming out of some of the news media. Take a look.
Guys, although it's an entire month away, stores are already lining their shelves with Valentine's Day garbage. And according to corporate America, nothing symbolizes love and commitment more than chocolate. See, the U.S. imports about 21% of the world's chocolate, and the average American eats over 11 pounds of it per year. This hardly comes as a surprise, considering how oversized candy bars are stuffed in every vending machine and store counter across America. But you might be surprised to learn that nearly every time you take a bite of that delicious sweetness, you have the hands of a child slave to thank. Yes, you heard me right. And the corporations most responsible for this horrendous practice are Mars, Hershey, and most of all, Nestle. If you're a fan of this show, you probably already know about my disdain for Nestle, which also happens to be the largest purveyor of bottled water worldwide. Because really, who could forget this?
Hello, Abby. I'm Stephanie from Nestle.
Yes, I was lucky enough to receive a personal response from their giant PR department after calling out the company's method of water extraction and privatization. Well, Nestle isn't just sucking up the world's water supply and selling it back to the poor chaps it's stealing it from. The corporation's also known for their chocolate monopoly and the slave labor that goes along with it. Nestle chocolate milk and powder aside, you might be surprised to learn that Nestle is the umbrella corporation that owns some of your favorite candy, including Kit Kat, Butterfinger, Wonka, Milky Way, Chunky, Smarties, 100 Grand, Baby Ruth, and even chocolate power bars. That's by no means an exhaustive list. To many, it's simply unthinkable that rewarding your child's sweet tooth has come at a devastating cost of another child's indentured servitude. Yet Africa's Ivory Coast produces more than half of the planet's chocolate, and the conditions on these cocoa farms there contain some of the world's most abysmal conditions for child workers.
Shocking pictures of children working with machetes and hazardous chemicals. Some said they were held against their will, forced to work, and many told us they never get paid. UNICEF estimates that more than 200,000 children could be involved in some of the worst forms of child labor.
Yes, at least 200,000 children are enslaved on the cocoa farms in the Ivory Coast alone. It's a country with no real laws against human trafficking, and as a result, children are being trafficked or outright stolen from their parents to work on the farms. These kids are around 11 to 15 years old, and many times even younger. According to an in-depth CNN investigation, they are forced to do hard manual labor, 80 to 100 hours a week, and paid absolutely nothing. Most of the children slaving away their lives on the field had never even eaten chocolate and have no idea what the cocoa is even used for. They have machete scars from cutting the brush all day and are severely beaten or even killed if they try to leave. What's perhaps most disturbing is that this is still happening 13 years after Congress passed the Harkin-Engel Protocol, or the Cocoa Protocol, in 2001. The bill called for public reporting by African governments to voluntarily certify that they had ended the practice of child labor. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. Today, human rights organizations report that some of the provisions still haven't been met, and no surprise, it's the biggest corporations who refuse to comply. But according to former CEO of Nestle, Peter Brabeck, the Ivory Coast would be worse off if Nestle weren't doing business there. That's the same guy that said water isn't a universal human right. So, what can we do to still fill our chocolate cravings without the guilt of knowing it's helping perpetuate the slave trade? Well, according to Washington Post, luckily there are several certifications on chocolate labels that indicate a slavery-free supply chain, including Fair Trade, Equal Exchange, and Rainforest Alliance. But ultimately, it's up to us, the consumers, to stop funding this practice, because I don't think protecting children is at the top of Nestle's priority list.
Right. Not at the top of the list, and perhaps even if it were at the top of the list, the question comes, can corporations do anything about the slave labor of children? It's not a self-evident, yes, of course they can. They're so powerful. Well, they're powerful in some ways, and they're certainly powerful in the marketing, refining, processing, adding sugar and various attractive other elements to it, making it into milk chocolate or various kinds of fancy presentations. They're powerful there. But what kind of power do they have over the labor force that produces it in household units of production on the domestic level? It's not clear. And in fact, it may be far more problematic than people think at the outset. So, when we listen to our children's addiction and interest in chocolate, keep in mind the several layers of difficulty here. Take a look.
I love chocolate. I can almost taste it right now.
Yeah.
Smallest and biggest. Okay, what's your favorite kind of company? What kind of company? Chocolate company. Hershey Kiss company? No. Definitely not.
Why not?
It's incredibly disturbing to realize that kids in the U.S. are eating chocolate that's made by the hands of kids halfway around the world.
There's 1.7 million children employed in the cocoa industry in West Africa.
Children working on a family farm part-time is not a problem. It's a problem when they start wielding machetes at the age of 5.
Handling pesticides or exposure to pesticides, carrying very heavy bags of cocoa beans.
When you see a child crying, that early in the morning, I want to go to school with my friends.
The fact that it does keep many of these children out of school means that they're being robbed twice. They're robbed of their childhood and they're robbed of their ability to reach their full capacity as an adult.
It's a complex problem, but the companies involved have the ability to fix it.
You need to be able to say, Hershey, there's a child on this farm, and what are you doing about that?
And the only people who really have the power to do that are consumers.
At the end of the day, we're all consumers. You are, I am, and if we join our voices, we will make an impact.
Well, if we join our voices, we will make an impact. The children have joined their voices, but they're, in a sense, the source and object of the consumption. Well, it has to be said that the valiant group of citizens that are getting organized here are looking at the cocoa industry and a century-long history of forced and child labor in the production of cocoa. It's important to step back and take that full historical look, because it's not a simple issue when you look at household production of smallholder farms. In a place like the Ivory Coast, it becomes very problematic when you look at the entire history, even more than the 100-year history, the pre-colonial history, prior to the arrival of European colonial rule. In a sense, the documentaries that have been made about it have focused on the recent period and not the historic period. There is a very good documentary that a group of citizens have put out called The Dark Side of Chocolate, and we should take a look at a little bit of it.
Everyone loves chocolate. 3 million tons of it are consumed every year, half of it in Europe. But the success of chocolate has a dark side. While first world kids are enjoying the sweet taste, reality is rather different for Africa's children. According to a wide range of organizations, the chocolate industry is accused of covering up the trafficking of children and the use of child labor on the cocoa plantations. We have decided to investigate these allegations. But the truth can be dangerous. We will go undercover with hidden cameras and assumed identities. Is it true that young children work as slaves in the chocolate industry? Our journey starts in Cologne, in Germany. Every year, the chocolate industry gathers to promote and sell their products. Chocolate that is primarily made of cocoa from cocoa pods. First, we want to find out where the cocoa is from.
The cocoa beans is from South America or Africa? Africa.
Elfenbeinküste.
Africa and South America.
Mostly from Ghana and
Ivory Coast.
Ivory Coast, yes.
Okay. Ivory Coast.
Ivory Coast, yes.
The Ivory Coast is the world's largest cocoa producer. But rumors abound about child labor and the trafficking of children.
Right. Child labor and the trafficking of children to work on the cocoa plantations. Some quite young, some with machetes that are needed in the processing. Some are women and girls that are employed in the fermentation stage before the beans are dried out in the sun, and they work quite hard as well, and everyone from about the age of 5 on can carry something. Maybe not a great deal, but as they grow older they can carry more and more, and carriage is a big part of this processing. They would like to go to school in many cases, but in fact they can't. They can't because they're obliged to do work on the cocoa farm. So, where did it all come from? How did it all get started? Well, we're reminded of the fact that cocoa itself is a New World crop. It came from Central America and throughout the islands in the Caribbean as well as South America, but it's not an African crop. In fact, it emerged as part of the slave trade in reverse. That is to say, it was a crop taken from the New World to the Old World, while the slaves were being brought from the Old World, Africa, to the New World, to all of these islands. You can see the Caribbean from space, and it's dotted with a lot of islands that make it ideal for plantation production. But the mainland part of Africa was not developed as plantation source material for the kinds of crops that were exported to Europe. In the initial part of the slave trade, they were the source of the labor going to the Caribbean. The European world controlled this part of the New World through the monopoly of transportation, and it set up a transatlantic system to bring slaves from Africa to the New World, the West Indies, and put them to work on plantations for a regular development of a triangular trade. Slaves coming from Africa for labor to work on plantations which produced agricultural surplus, cotton, principally sugar in the first years, indigo to some extent, all of which was going to Europe to be processed, and then the European manufactured goods were brought down to Africa to buy further slaves, particularly guns and powder and machetes, as it turns out. The old maps of the period make this very clear, giving indications of where you can get the most slaves as well as where you can anchor for the trade in goods that you're bringing from Europe. And historians have started to look at the trade in detail by digitizing the maps and looking at the emergence of this trade over time. It's depicted in several slightly fanciful representations by the end of the 19th century. They're fanciful in the sense that they're not photographic. They're an impression of an artist of what went on 100 years, 150 years earlier. But they're interesting in their detail in these impressionistic statements. If you look at them carefully, you can see that there's a certain amount of alcohol involved. And of course, that's always the case on early frontiers. You try to trade, if you're a dominant power, like the Europeans were, in addictives. You try to get your trading partner addicted to something you have to offer. In this case, rum from the sugar plantations in the New World. Another part of that trade is visible again from the print. In addition to the alcohol, in this case being consumed by women, there's a very interesting second commodity that's implied here. See the pipe? Again, a woman is smoking tobacco on a pipe. Alcohol, tobacco, and what else? Well, you guessed it, firearms. There you have it, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, ATF. From the beginning of the international trade, the effort is to trade things in people, and people, in this case they're trading for slaves, but they're getting in Africa the firearms, the tobacco, and the alcohol in exchange, and with that they extend their power to the interior. That's very important. This is an asymmetrical, that is not evenly supplied armament that's used in not just an economy of production, but an economy of destruction. These people with firearms can gain power over those who don't have firearms. This is part of the Columbian Exchange, which is introduced by the Portuguese, Dutch, English, French, and elsewhere, and they exchange biological material too. That biological consequence of the Columbian Exchange is very interesting because it's part of that which leads to the ecological imperialism of the Europeans at this time. The biological expansion continues after the triangular trade, but it's in different commodities and different directions. In particular, in the post-slave trade moment, the moment of so-called legitimate trade, that is, they're not trading any longer in human beings, but they're taking New World crops and introducing them to Africa to be grown in plantation forms there, and those new crops are introduced sometimes voluntarily and quite often by the late 19th century, they're introduced forcibly, voluntarily and forcefully. There have been a number of studies of this kind of thing, of the early colonial rule and the brutality of it, looking at the agents of empire, and particularly the forceful use of machine guns and the like to mow down oppositions to this new introduction of cash crops. And if you look at it as steps towards an ecology of imperialism, you can sort of understand that this is a violent process which leads to the basis of cash cropping in West Africa. We need to remember the social legacy and the history of the slave trade and the specific circumstances surrounding the introduction of these cash crops. Cocoa grows on trees, but chocolate does not. We need to understand how cocoa becomes chocolate and what happens to the cocoa producers in the process. Think of it as a legacy of the slave trade. Some groups have come to own the means of destruction. Others do not have that means of destruction. Some groups own title to ownership of land. Others do not. Those without title to land have to work for others that do have title, as hired labor or through sharecropping. Children of sharecroppers do not effectively have the same rights of children whose parents or relatives own land. They may need to work instead of going to school, work on the cocoa plantations owned by Africans in smallholders. The international community may do what it wants to guide new trade practices and admonish companies like Hershey and Nestle to do better in their sourcing of material, but these companies themselves can't intervene very effectively in the domestic domain. The question of sharecropping and the labor of sharecroppers' children is not something they have immediate control over. This is why a new kind of citizen science alliance is emerging around the world to look at this kind of inequity as a result of the slave trade.